On the rain-soaked streets of Santa Fe, a grieving widow was thrown out of her husband's family home with nothing but her newborn in her arms. No money, no protection, and no place to go. But just when it seemed the storm would swallow her whole, a stranger appeared. And what he did next would change not only her fate, but the destiny of an entire family. Stay with me until the end, because this story is wilder than any legend of the Wild West. The sky over Santa Fe carried the color of iron that morning, heavy and relentless, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary of mercy. Rain had been falling since dawn, soaking through the black coats of mourners gathered in the small churchyard on the edge of town. The smell of cedar and raw earth hung thick, clinging to boots, to breath, to every solemn word that slipped from the preacher's lips. Eliza Monroe stood at the grave's edge, her body stiff, though her dress clung cold and damp to her skin. In her arms lay her newborn son, swaddled in a blanket already damp from the mist. His tiny chest rose and fell with uneven rhythm, his warmth the only living fire left to her, since Daniel was lowered into the ground. She kissed the crown of his head, not for comfort, but for anchor. If she didn't hold on to him, she feared she might vanish entirely into the storm. Across the grave, Margaret Monroe, her mother-in-law, stood rigid as a monument. Her face was carved from stone, her eyes burning with the kind of fury grief alone could not explain. When the final clump of dirt struck the coffin lid with a hollow, merciless thud, Margaret stepped forward. The crowd parted around her, as if she carried the authority of Scripture itself. Her voice cut through the rain, sharp enough to wound. From this moment on, she said, her tone slicing through the gray morning, "You are no longer part of this family. Take your child and your things and leave this land." The air itself seemed to stop. Even the preacher faltered his Bible, trembling in his hands. Eliza blinked the words, colliding with her mind in fragments too cruel to comprehend. "Mrs. Monroe," she tried, her voice cracking like a snapped twig. "You heard me?" Margaret spat, her face twisting. "My son lies dead because he chained himself to the wrong woman. You brought him nothing but ruin. And now you would poison my household further not another day." A murmur rippled through the mourners. Some lowered their heads, unwilling to be seen agreeing, yet unwilling to step forward. Others looked at Eliza with something worse than judgment pity. She wanted to scream that pity was poison, that it cost nothing, and gave nothing, but her voice betrayed her. "You would cast me out with a newborn child," she whispered. "I already have," Margaret replied. Her hand flicked sharply, and the Monroe foreman stepped forward. In his arms he carried a battered trunk and a small bundle of clothes. Without ceremony, he dropped them into the mud at Eliza's feet. The lid snapped open on impact, spilling threadbare garments and a baby's blanket into the muck. "That is all you brought into this family," Margaret said. "And that is all you will take away." Eliza knelt in the mud hands, trembling as she gathered the soaked blanket, tucking it around her infant son with fierce tenderness. She felt every eye upon her, the preacher's wife's sorrowful glance, the blank indifference of ranch hands, the sharp curiosity of neighbors hungry for scandal. Someone whispered behind her, "That blood never settles." Rising slowly, Eliza straightened her spine, though the rain dragged at her hair, plastering it against her pale face. She said nothing more to Margaret Monroe. Words would change nothing. With her chin lifted in quiet defiance, she clutched her son close and turned toward the road. The muddy track stretched endlessly before her. Each step sank into the earth, heavy, reluctant, yet determined. Behind her, whispers stirred, but no one called her back. The family she had once belonged to by marriage, by love, had cast her into the storm without a second thought. By the time she reached the edge of Santa Fe, the rain had softened to a mist, yet the weight pressing on her chest only deepened. The town lay silent, its boardwalks slick, its windows glowing faintly against the gloom. Eastward lay the flats barren and merciless. Westward rose the hills wild and unyielding. Neither path promised safety, but both demanded decision. Her son whimpered a frail sound that tore through the quiet street. Eliza pressed her lips to his damp forehead, whispering a vow she barely believed she could keep. "I will keep you safe. Somehow." The vow was a thread, fragile but unbreakable. And then hoofbeats. They came slowly, steadily muffled by the softened earth. Eliza froze, turning toward the sound. Out of the mist emerged a lone rider, his figure cut sharp against the horizon. A bay gelding carried him with the sure-footed patience of a beast that had traveled many miles. The man sat tall in the saddle, his broad shoulders wrapped in a trail-worn coat, the brim of his hat dripping with rain. As he drew nearer, the details sharpened. A lean, angular face, eyes narrowed not with suspicion, but with assessment, steady and unflinching. He reined the horse to a halt a few feet away, regarding her in silence for a long moment. "Mrs. Monroe," he said finally, his voice low, and even carrying the kind of weight that came from years of saying little, but meaning much. "I heard about Daniel." Her throat tightened. She gave a single nod. "It seems everyone has." His gaze flicked down to the child in her arms, then back to her weary face. "Where are you headed?" The truth came raw, unvarnished. "I don't know." The words hung between them, swallowed by the mist. For a long moment he said nothing. The gelding shifted, breathing slow and steady, as if even the horse understood the gravity of the pause. At last the man swung down from the saddle. His boots sank into the mud with a quiet finality. "Name's James Callahan," he said. "Rode alongside Daniel more than once. He was a good man." Eliza studied him, suspicion warring with exhaustion. She clutched her child tighter, bracing for judgment, for pity, for another blow from a world already cruel enough. But James Callahan's eyes carried none of that. He looked not at her disgrace, but at her resolve. His gaze lingered on the battered trunk, abandoned in the street, then rose again to meet hers. "Looks like you could use somewhere dry to stand," he said. Her jaw set. "I don't want charity. Charity's when someone gives because they feel sorry for you," he answered. His tone was steady, not sharp. "This isn't that. It's too far to town in this weather, and your boy's already cold. My ranch is west a few miles. You can decide what comes after once you've warmed up." The silence that followed was not empty. It was a test, a reckoning. Eliza stood, rain dripping from her lashes, the whole of her future balanced in that pause. She could walk into the flats and vanish into nothing, or she could take the hand of a stranger who spoke with the weight of a man who meant what he said. Her son whimpered again, a fragile plea. Eliza swallowed hard, then gave a single trembling nod. James stepped forward, lifting the trunk with one hand and setting it across his saddle. Then he extended the other hand toward her. His grip was steady, his palm calloused, his strength undeniable. For the first time that day, Eliza felt something solid beneath her, an anchor in the storm. He helped her into the saddle, then mounted behind her, the warmth of his coat pressing against her back, as the gelding moved into an easy lope toward the mist-shrouded hills. The road blurred beneath them, the rain thinning to a whisper. Eliza said nothing, but deep in her chest, where grief and fear had carved hollow places, something stirred. A question, a possibility. For the first time since Daniel's death, she did not feel entirely abandoned to the storm. And though she could not yet know it, the moment James Callahan stepped down from his horse was the moment the rest of her story began. The trail to James Callahan's ranch wound through the Rio Grande Valley, like a ribbon of mud and stone. Dusk had already begun to creep in the light, fading into a bruised purple that stretched across the hills. Eliza sat stiffly in the saddle, the child pressed against her chest, her hands gripping him as if the very earth might try to snatch him away. She was exhausted, but more than that, she was hollowed out. The rain had slowed to a mist, yet its chill clung to her bones. Each hoofbeat carried her farther from Santa Fe, farther from the family who had disowned her, and deeper into a future she could not yet imagine. James said nothing. He rode with the kind of silence that wasn't born of shyness but of deliberation. He didn't fill the air with words that might have soothed or startled her. Instead, he let the quiet settle, as if allowing her space to breathe in the enormity of what had just happened. The gelding's steady gait became a rhythm that steadied her heartbeat, though she wouldn't admit it aloud. By the time they reached the homestead, lantern light glowed faintly through the cabin window. The sight struck Eliza with something she hadn't expected, a pang so sharp it nearly broke her. It was the look of shelter, of warmth, of a place where the wind might be kept at bay. She had been cast out into the storm with nothing but a child and a trunk. Now, here was a door lit against the dark. James swung down from the saddle, his boots sinking into the softened earth. Without speaking, he reached up to steady her as she dismounted. She felt his strength in that touch, unhurried, steady as if he had all the time in the world. He carried her trunk inside, and when she crossed the threshold, she was met with the scent of wood smoke and the gentle crackle of a fire already burning. The cabin was modest, worn with years, but it breathed of permanence. A stone fireplace dominated the room, throwing golden light across wooden beams darkened with age. A sturdy table stood against one wall, its surface scarred with use. Every detail spoke of hands that had built, repaired, tended hands that belonged to someone who knew what it was to endure. James returned, carrying something she had not expected, a cradle. Its wood was smooth polished by time, though the grain still bore the marks of a craftsman's knife. He set it near the fire, his touch reverent. "This belonged to my sister," he said quietly, not meeting her eyes. "Been locked away since she passed. Figured it was time it saw use again." Eliza's throat tightened. She lowered her child into the cradle with careful hands, tucking the damp blanket around him. For the first time since the coffin closed over Daniel, she felt a thread of safety. The firelight flickered across the wood, and the sight of her son sleeping in that cradle was almost unbearable in its gentleness. James busied himself with the kettle, setting water to boil over the flames. "You'll need something warm before you rest," he said, his voice calm, practical. "Weather's colder tonight." She sank onto the sofa, her body aching from the day's march through grief and mud. She could barely summon words. Yet she watched him, watched the way he moved with purpose, no gesture wasted, no noise made where silence would do. He was not like the men she had known in Santa Fe, men who filled the air with talk to prove their strength. James Callahan did not need to prove anything. When he handed her the steaming cup, she took it in both hands, letting the heat seep into her fingers. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded, settling into the chair across from her. The firelight carved the lines of his face into sharper relief, the hard planes of a man who had lived more outside than in the eyes of someone who measured his words before spending them. "Daniel was a good man," he said at last. "Helped me more than once when I had no right to ask. I owe him for that." Eliza looked down at the tea, the words catching in her throat. "You don't even know me," she said softly. James's gaze met hers, steady, unwavering. "I know you've been walking through the rain with a child in your arms when you ought to be by a fire. That's enough." The room fell quiet again, filled only by the crackle of wood and the baby's soft breathing. Eliza wrapped her arms around herself, trying to absorb the heat of the fire, But what seeped deeper than the warmth was the strange realization that she was not being pitied. James had not brought her here out of charity. His words carried the weight of a man honoring a debt, perhaps, but they also carried something more, something like recognition. The storm outside raged itself into silence as the night wore on. Eliza found herself staring at the cradle, at the way her son's small hands rested by his face, at the way the firelight seemed to guard him. Her chest ached with the memory of Margaret Monroe's voice, cold as steel, declaring her unfit, unwanted, cast out. And yet, here in a stranger's cabin, her child slept in a place that felt chosen. She wondered if James Callahan knew what kind of gift he had given her simply by setting that cradle near the fire. Perhaps he did. Perhaps that was why he had said so little. When she finally lay down on the sofa, boots neatly set beside it, a heavy quilt drawn over her shoulders, Eliza felt the weight of exhaustion press her into the cushions. She had expected only a chair by the fire, maybe a night's rest before being told to move on. Instead, she had been given something far rarer, a sense, however fragile, that she was not entirely alone in the world. Sleep claimed her quickly. In her dreams, the storm was still raging, the voices still whispering, but each time the thunder came, there was a figure beside her, silent, steady, unflinching. When she woke again, in the gray of morning, the fire had burned low but steady. The kettle simmered faintly. James was already at the door, pulling on his coat, preparing for whatever work the day demanded. He glanced back at her, his face unreadable but his voice certain. "You're safe here," he said simply, and then stepped outside into the dawn. Eliza lay back against the quilt, her son stirring softly in the cradle. The words lingered in the air like a vow. For the first time since her world had shattered, she believed them. The days at the Callahan ranch began to fall into a rhythm Eliza had never known she needed. At dawn, the light spilled across the Rio Grande Valley. In streaks of gold, the sound of cattle lowing carried on the crisp air. James was always the first to rise, his boots sounding against the wooden floorboards as he stepped out into the yard. By the time Eliza stirred, cradling Samuel against her chest, she would catch the distant sight of him already at work, mending a fence line, leading the horses down to water, or hauling wood from the pile. At first, she kept to the cabin, tending to the baby, sweeping floors, folding linens that seemed perpetually worn but clean. Yet the walls pressed in on her. She had not been built for idleness, and though grief weighed heavy, so did the urge to prove that she was more than a burden on another man's roof. When James returned in the evenings, his shoulders dusted with sweat and grit, she would see the strain etched into him. She felt the pull to step into that world, to take on her share. It was on a morning thick with the scent of sage and sun-warmed dust that she first walked out into the yard, Samuel held snug against her in a sling. James was struggling to steady a broken fence rail, the wood splintering under his grip. Eliza stepped forward without hesitation. "Let me help," she said. James looked up, his brow creasing in disbelief. "This isn't work for someone like me," she interrupted, her voice sharp with defiance. "I've held my ground through worse than a fence post, Mr. Callahan. Don't mistake grief for fragility." For a moment, his eyes held hers, testing, measuring. Then, with a faint nod, he stepped aside. "All right, hold it steady." The rail was heavier than she had expected, the rough wood biting into her palms, but she gritted her teeth and steadied it, while James hammered the nails in place. When the work was finished, her arms ached, but there was pride in the ache. She caught James watching her, not with pity, not even with surprise, but with a flicker of respect. From that day on, the ranch no longer belonged solely to James Callahan. Eliza began to carve her place into it. She learned to saddle a horse, her hands trembling at first, but steadier with each attempt. She rode along the fence line, Samuel strapped to her chest, the wind lifting her hair as she absorbed the landscape, its silence, its secrets, its harsh beauty. James taught her to read the sky for storms, to listen to the restless shift of cattle that foretold trouble. She burned her fingers once cooking over the outdoor fire, earning a soft chuckle from James and a muttered, "You'll learn faster than you think." The work stitched something back together inside her piece by piece. Every task became a defiance against the memory of Margaret Monroe's words, against the pitying eyes of Santa Fe. She was not porcelain. She was not an outcast clinging to another man's charity. She was alive, working, shaping her place with her own hands. Still, the outside world did not forget her. When she ventured into town for medicine, whispers trailed her like shadows. Women turned away, their conversations halting mid-sentence. Men eyed her with suspicion, their stares lingering not on her, but on the sling that held her child. The sharpest blow came on a day when she stood at the counter of the pharmacy asking for tincture. Margaret Monroe's voice rang out from the boardwalk, cold and cutting. "Well, if it isn't the widow, living off another man already, are you, eating his bread, warming his bed?" The words struck Eliza like stones, but she refused to lower her chin. The crowd around them shifted, murmuring. Margaret stepped closer, her black skirts sweeping dust across Eliza's boots. "Your child carries Monroe blood." Margaret continued, her voice rising for all to hear. "And yet you shame that name by hiding on Callahan's land like some stray. Daniel would be sick to see it." The silence that followed was suffocating. Eliza's grip on her satchel tightened until her knuckles whitened. She was about to speak when movement flickered at the edge of her vision. James stepped out from between two wagons, his hat brim shadowing his eyes. He didn't look at her first. His gaze locked on Margaret, calm, unyielding. "That's enough, Mrs. Monroe." "This is no concern of yours, Mr. Callahan," she snapped. "It is when you speak about someone under my roof." His voice was steady, not raised, yet it cut cleaner than a shout. He moved forward until he stood between Eliza and Margaret, his stance easy but unmistakably protective. "She is my guest. Anyone with a problem with her can take it up with me." The street stilled. The shopkeeper leaned on his counter, frozen. The preacher's wife, passing by, clutched her shawl tighter. Even the horses tethered nearby seemed to fall silent. Margaret's lips thinned to a hard line. For the first time, her confidence faltered. She gave a sharp sniff, turned on her heel, and stalked away, her companions trailing after her. Eliza stared at James, her breath caught. He didn't meet her eyes at first, only tipped his hat, then looked toward the pharmacy door. "Still need that medicine?" he asked quietly. She nodded, unable to speak. He took the satchel from her hand without asking, and opened the door for her. Inside, as she gathered the tincture, her heart was still pounding. She realized then that something fundamental had shifted. James Callahan had not just offered her shelter. He had drawn a line in the dust, declaring before the whole town that she belonged under his roof, and anyone who wanted to challenge her would have to go through him. Back at the ranch, she lay awake that night listening to the fire crackle, Samuel's soft breaths steady beside her. She thought of the way James had stood in that street, calm, unshaken, unwilling to let her bear the weight of public scorn alone. She thought of how he had watched her repair the fence, how he had taught her to saddle a horse without underestimating her. Respect was a rare currency in the West, and somehow she had earned his. It terrified her as much as it steadied her. She had been thrown into the storm, cast out as if her life were worth nothing. Yet here she was under a roof where her presence mattered. The walls of the cabin no longer felt like walls at all, but like a foundation, something being built, though neither of them had yet spoken the words. In the quiet of that night, Eliza pressed her lips to her son's forehead and whispered a promise she now believed she could keep. "You are not unwanted. You are not alone. "We are not alone." And for the first time she dared to believe it was true. The wind that swept across the Rio Grande Valley carried a new sharpness, the kind that warned of storms brewing beyond the horizon. Life on the Callahan ranch had found a fragile rhythm, but Eliza knew that peace was rarely left unchallenged in the West. She could feel the shift in James, too, in the way his gaze lingered longer at the edge of the pastures, in the quiet way his shoulders carried a weight she could not yet name. It was late afternoon when the first shadow stepped across their land. A rider came slow up the track, his horse coated in dust, his hat pulled low. James had been repairing the gate by the corral sleeves, rolled up hands steady on the worn wood. At the sound of hooves, he straightened his jaw, tightening even before the rider came into view. Silas Kane dismounted with a practiced ease, a smirk twisting his mouth. He was a man whose name traveled faster than he did a broker with ties to the Denver and Pacific Railroad. He was the kind of man who didn't ask, only took. "Heard you're still clinging to this patch of dirt, Callahan," Silas said, brushing dust from his coat. "Word is, the railroad's paying good money for land just like this. More than you'll see running cattle till the day you drop." James wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes flat. "Not for sale." Silas chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "That's what the others said. Until they learned the men I work for don't like the word no. And with a woman and a baby under your roof, you might want to think twice about what trouble's worth." The air seemed to sharpen between them. Eliza, standing on the porch with Samuel in her arms, caught every word. A cold coil of fear twisted in her stomach, but James's voice came low, steady. "You ride back and tell them my answer's still no," he said. "And if they come looking for trouble, they'd best come ready." For a moment, Silas studied him, searching for hesitation, for weakness. He found none. With a mocking tip of his hat, he swung into the saddle. "Your funeral, Callahan," he muttered, before riding back toward town. When the dust settled, Eliza stepped down from the porch. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice sharper than she intended. "An old mistake," James answered. Looked like more than that. His eyes flickered toward the road Silas had taken. "We fought together once. He left me behind when things went bad. Now he's working for men who don't stop until they've taken what they want." The truth hung heavy in the evening air. Eliza folded her arms, watching him, realizing that the land he guarded was not just pasture and cattle. It was memory family, the last inheritance of those who had come before. And now it was also hers, whether she had chosen it or not. A week later, the threat revealed its teeth. They had driven the cattle toward the lower pasture clouds, heavy overhead, the air sharp with the scent of coming rain. The trail narrowed to a ledge cut into the hillside, the valley yawning below. James rode ahead, scanning the ridge. Eliza followed her eyes, catching on something out of place. The soil above looked fresher, the rocks piled too neatly balanced like a trap waiting to be sprung. Her blood ran cold. "James," she called, her voice carrying above the restless cattle. He turned in the saddle, his gaze following the line of her finger. Without hesitation he dismounted, boots sliding on loose gravel as he climbed toward the ridge. A glint of metal caught his eye, a frayed rope half buried beneath the soil, tied to a wedge that held the rocks in place. Silas James muttered, and no sooner had the word left his mouth than the sharp crack of wood split the air. The wedge shifted. "Move," he roared. The world exploded in sound. Boulders tore free, thundering down the slope, smashing onto the trail with bone-shaking force. Dust and rock filled the air, the cattle bellowing in panic as they scattered down the slope. Eliza's horse reared, but she held her seat, waving her arms, shouting to drive the herd away from the ravine. James leapt back into the saddle, spurring his gelding forward, just as the last of the rocks crashed onto the path behind them. For one breathless second, the ledge vanished in a storm of stone and dust. When the noise finally ebbed, the air hung thick and choking. James turned in the saddle, his chest heaving. "You saw it before I did," he said, his voice rough. Eliza's face was pale, but her eyes were steady. "My father lost a wagon team that way. I know the signs." Their gazes held something unspoken passing between them. In that moment, James saw her not as someone under his protection, but as someone standing beside him, equal in the fight. They regrouped the cattle on the lower slope, the herd uneasy but alive. The wind picked up, carrying the promise of snow, but neither spoke of fear. They rode on together, the silence between them now threaded with something stronger than words. Yet the danger did not end on the hillside. Weeks later, the council hall of Santa Fe filled with smoke and restless voices. Every seat was taken, merchants whispering, ranchers shifting uneasily. At the front, Mayor Grenshaw rapped his gavel against the table. "The Denver and Pacific Railroad has made a generous offer for the land needed to lay their track," he announced, his voice booming. "This will bring jobs, trade, prosperity. We'd be fools to turn it down." Cheers rose from the merchants. A few ranchers nodded. James rose slowly from the back, his hat in his hand. His voice carried clear-cutting through the room. "And whose land will that track run through mine? That pasture you call expendable is the only ground that will feed my herd through winter. Take it, and they starve before spring." Murmurs rippled. The mayor leaned forward. "You're one man standing in the way of progress. And you're a room full of men willing to sell your neighbor's grave for a train schedule that'll change the moment Denver says so," James shot back. The tension was thick, heavy enough to choke the air. Then the back door opened with a quiet creak. Eliza stepped inside, Samuel in her arms. Her hair was damp from drizzle, her boots leaving prints on the wooden floor as she crossed the hall. She did not speak, but she did not need to. She walked to stand behind James, the child stirring softly against her shoulder. The room shifted. Men who had been leaning forward now sat back. Whispers faltered. Her presence was not loud, but it was undeniable, a statement stronger than words. James did not turn, but her nearness settled at his back like armor. "You wanted to see who this land matters to," he said. "You're looking at them. My name's on the deed, but it feeds more than cattle. It feeds a family." The vote was called. Hands rose more for the railroad than against, but not enough to pass. The motion stalled, suspended in limbo. The mayor slammed his gavel down, his voice tight with frustration. "This isn't over." "I know," James said, setting his hat back on his head. "Neither am I." He stepped aside for Eliza, and together they walked to the length of the hall, the baby quiet in her arms. The room held its breath until the door shut behind them. Outside, the boardwalk glistened with rain, the scent of wet cedar thick in the air. James glanced at her, his eyes steady, unreadable. "You didn't have to come." "I know," she said softly, lifting her chin. "But I wasn't about to let you stand alone." Something in his chest eased at those words, though he gave no outward sign. They walked on together, the storm far from over, but the line between them now unbreakable. The autumn air in Santa Fe carried the scent of roasted corn and apples, mingled with the sharper tang of wood smoke rising from chimneys. Strings of lanterns hung above the main street, swaying in the cool breeze, casting warm pools of light across the packed dirt. Children ran laughing between the booths, clutching candied apples, their joy breaking through the heavy mood that still lingered from weeks of tension over the railroad's demands. The Harvest Festival had always been a night when the town tried to forget its worries to remind itself that life could still be celebrated. But this year, whispers spread through the crowd with every glance toward the tall figure who lingered at the edge of the square. James Callahan was not a man who sought attention yet. All eyes were waiting for him. Eliza stood nearby. Samuel balanced on her hip, his wide eyes reflecting the glow of the lanterns. She felt the weight of those whispers as surely as James did. The townsfolk had seen her walk into the council hall with her child, had seen the way James had stood his ground against the railroad's men. Respect was a hard-earned currency in the West, and though some still muttered behind closed doors, many now looked at her with cautious curiosity, as if waiting to see what she would become under the Callahan name. James had spent most of the evening quietly speaking politely when spoken to, tipping his hat to neighbors who had once kept their distance. But Eliza noticed how the fiddler's song came to an end, and how James's gaze shifted toward the small wooden platform near the gazebo. His decision came without ceremony, the kind of quiet inevitability that marked so much of who he was. He strode toward the steps, and a hush fell over the square. He removed his hat, holding it at his side, his eyes sweeping over the townsfolk gathered before him. He was not a polished man, not a speaker trained for crowds, yet his voice carried with a weight that made people lean closer. Evening, he began simply, "You all know me. You know my land, my cattle, the name on my deed. But there's something you may not know, or something you've chosen not to see." The crowd stirred whispers rising like wind through dry grass. James reached into his vest and withdrew a folded parchment. The firelight caught on the seal gleaming faintly. "This," he said, lifting it for all to see, "is the deed to the Callahan ranch. I've made changes to it." He stepped down from the platform, his boots thudding softly against the wooden boards, and walked toward Eliza. The crowd parted instinctively, their eyes fixed on him. Standing before her, his voice softened but carried still. "Eliza Monroe, you've stood on that land these past months not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who's worked, fought, and bled for it alongside me. And your boy," he paused, looking down at Samuel with a gentleness that pierced straight to Eliza's chest. "He's as much a Callahan as I am." A wave of murmurs rippled through the square. Eliza's breath caught her arms tightening around Samuel as James unfolded the parchment. He read aloud with a steady voice, "Samuel Callahan, rightful heir to the Callahan ranch." The words rang out like a bell, clear and final. Eliza's throat tightened, her eyes stinging as tears welled unbidden. James's gaze did not waver from hers. "This land will be his one day," he said firmly. "Until then, it is yours to call home. No council, no company, no family will take that away." For a long moment, silence reigned. Then a pair of hands began to clap, slow but certain. Another joined, then another. The applause rolled through the crowd until it was a storm of sound, a tide of voices and hands rising to meet the moment. At the far edge of the lantern-lit street, Margaret Monroe stood rigid as stone. Her black bonnet shadowed her pale face, but her eyes told the truth her power had crumbled. Whatever claim she had tried to hold over Eliza and her child was gone, shattered not by vengeance, but by a vow spoken openly before the town. James turned slightly, placing a hand gently against Samuel's back. "Santa Fe," he said, his voice lifting above the applause, "meet Samuel Callahan." The cheer that followed was louder, filled not with whispers of doubt, but with warmth acceptance, perhaps even pride. Eliza's vision blurred as she tried to take it in the music. Starting again, children darting through the crowd, neighbors clapping James on the back, women nodding to her with something resembling respect. Yet all she could feel was the steady weight of Samuel in her arms and the unshakable certainty of the man who stood beside her. That night, as they walked back to the ranch beneath the quiet sweep of stars, Eliza felt something in her chest that she had not known in months, a sense of belonging. She had been cast into the storm with nothing but her child and the strength to keep walking, and somehow step by step she had found her way to this. The seasons turned. Snow came early that winter, blanketing the valley in silence, and then gave way to spring's thaw. By summer, the fields were alive again, the cattle grazing in the northern pastures James had fought so hard to keep. Eliza worked alongside him as though she had always been there tending the garden, riding fence lines, carrying Samuel on her hip as she moved through the rhythms of the ranch. The whispers in town faded into nods of acknowledgement, then into greetings. Respect grew slow but steady like roots anchoring deep into the soil. A year after the night of the harvest festival, the ranch looked both unchanged and entirely different. The house still bore its weathered beams. The fences still creaked under the wind, but laughter now echoed in the yard where silence had once reigned. Samuel's small feet stumbled across the packed dirt as James knelt behind him, steadying him with strong hands. One step at a time, little man James murmured, his voice softer than Eliza had ever heard it. Samuel wobbled, nearly fell, then found his balance again, and James's quiet smile reached his eyes. From the porch, Eliza watched, her heart full. She remembered the night she had been cast out into the rain, the humiliation of Margaret Monroe's words, the terror of not knowing where she would sleep. She remembered standing in the middle of an empty street, convinced she had no place left in the world. And she remembered the moment James Callahan had stepped down from his horse and offered her shelter without asking anything in return. That was the moment the tide had shifted, though she had not known it then. Later that evening, James sat in the workshop, the lantern light pooling around him as he bent over the old cradle that had once belonged to his sister. With careful strokes of his knife, he carved letters into the smooth upper rail. Eliza stepped closer, Samuel in her arms, and saw the name taking shape beneath his hands. Samuel Callahan. Each stroke carried more than a name. It was a promise, a sealing of what had been true since the night he had lifted them out of the mud. When James finished, he brushed the shavings aside and leaned back, his eyes meeting hers with the same unflinching steadiness he had shown in the council hall in the street on the hillside. Eliza traced the carved letters with her fingertips, her voice trembling with emotion. "It's perfect." The sun dipped below the hills, casting the sky in copper and violet. Eliza stood in the doorway, watching James lift Samuel into his arms, the boy's laughter ringing clear. They stepped inside together, the lamplight spilling across the porch, warm against the coming dark. Eliza thought of the vow she had once whispered in the street, desperate and uncertain. "I will keep you safe." Somehow. Now she knew the truth. She had not only kept him safe, she had found them a home. A man had stood before the town and declared her son his blood, a vow stronger than any paper, stronger than any force the railroad or the Monroes could summon. The cradle creaked softly in the next room, the name Samuel Callahan rocking gently in the shadows. And Eliza knew with a certainty as deep as the land beneath her feet that whatever storms came, this would always be their place, the home they had built together. The story of Eliza Monroe and James Callahan begins with rain falling over Santa Fe, New Mexico, on the day Eliza lost everything she had thought was secure. Her husband Daniel had been lowered into the earth, and with him went her claim to the Monroe family, her protection, her place. His mother, Margaret Monroe, wasted no time in severing ties, turning Eliza and her newborn child out into the mud with nothing but a trunk and a few threadbare belongings. The scene was one of cruelty dressed as righteousness, a reminder that grief in the West was often wielded like a weapon. Eliza, stripped of home, and kin stood at the edge of town facing two directions, east toward the merciless flats or west into the uncertain hills. That was the moment James Callahan entered her life. James was no savior in shining armor, nor did he pretend to be. He was a rancher scarred by his own history, bound to the land that had shaped him. He had ridden alongside Daniel once and remembered the loyalty of a man who had his back when it counted. When James dismounted his horse that day and offered Eliza shelter, he was not offering charity. He was honoring a code that ran deeper than bloodlines or town gossip, a promise between men of the trail, extended now to the woman and child left behind. Eliza followed him to his ranch in the Rio Grande Valley, a modest homestead warmed by a fire and steadied by James's quiet presence. There, she began to rebuild herself piece by piece. At first, she remained cautious, expecting to be told she was temporary and inconvenience. But the cradle James placed near the fire once belonging to his sister told another story. It was an act not of pity but of permanence, a sign that she and her child had a place in the life of the ranch. Over time, Eliza refused to remain only a guest. She took up work alongside James, her hands learning the weight of fence rails, the feel of reins, the language of the land. Every nail she hammered, every saddle she strapped, was a defiance against Margaret Monroe's words, against the whispers in town that said she was unworthy. She learned that survival in the West was not just about endurance, but about staking one's place in the world through grit and determination. James, who at first taught her cautiously, came to recognize her as an equal. The world beyond their ranch, however, had no intention of leaving them in peace. Silas Kane, a man tied to the railroad, arrived to pressure James into selling the land the Denver and Pacific Railroad coveted. His threats were veiled at first, but when intimidation failed, violence followed. On the narrow mountain pass, Eliza's sharp eyes caught the signs of a trap, fresh soil-balanced rocks, a rope buried beneath the dirt. Her warning saved their lives when the boulders came thundering down, and in that moment James understood fully what he had perhaps already known. Eliza was no longer someone he protected. She was someone who stood beside him. Their fight did not end in the mountains. It carried into the council hall of Santa Fe, where the town gathered to decide the fate of James's northern pastures. The railroad promised progress and wealth, but James knew that land meant survival, not just sentiment. He stood his ground alone, at first defying the mayor and the merchants, until Eliza walked into the room with Samuel in her arms. She did not need to speak. Her presence said everything. Together they turned the tide, stalling the vote, proving that unity forged in hardship carried more weight than promises of gold from strangers. The true turning point came under the lantern light of the Harvest Festival. James, a man of few words, stepped onto the platform and laid his truth before the entire town. He held up the deed to his ranch and declared Samuel Callahan its rightful heir. In that single act, he erased Margaret Monroe's cruelty, silenced the whispers of charity, and placed Eliza and her child under the name and protection of his bloodline. It was more than a legal document. It was a vow spoken publicly and irrevocably. The applause that followed rolled through the streets like a storm, and with it came acceptance, respect, and something even rarer in the untamed West belonging. Seasons passed, and what had begun as survival grew into a life. Samuel took his first steps in the yard of the ranch, steadied by James's hands. Eliza tended the garden road fence lines and found her laughter again in the rhythm of work and home. The cradle, once tucked in the corner of the cabin, bore Samuel's name carved deep into its wood, a promise etched by James's own hand. Together, they built not just shelter but a foundation strong enough to weather whatever storms might come. The lesson woven into Eliza's journey is one that reaches beyond the dust and danger of the 19th century frontier. It is a reminder that strength is not found in standing alone, but in standing together. Eliza's courage lay not just in enduring humiliation and loss, but in refusing to let those moments define her. She carved out her worth in action, in resilience, in the determination to protect her child and claim her place. James's strength was not in the breadth of his shoulders or the sharpness of his defiance, but in the quiet integrity that made his words stronger than any contract. When he chose to honor Eliza and Samuel, he did not just offer them protection. He created a family bound by choice, not circumstance. In our lives today, we may not face boulders rolling down a mountainside or land barrens backed by the railroad, but the essence of the struggle remains. We know what it feels like to be cast aside, underestimated, or whispered about. We know the sting of rejection and the weight of carrying responsibilities alone. Eliza's story reminds us that dignity is not given by others. It is claimed through the choices we make. It teaches us that trust once earned can turn strangers into family. And it proves that even in the darkest storms, the smallest act of recognition, the steady hand of someone who sees us for who we are, can change the course of a life. To live with courage today means to step forward when the world expects you to bow, to carve your own place when others would rather erase you, and to stand with those who need you when it would be easier to walk away. It means building homes not just of wood and stone, but of loyalty, integrity, and love, the kind of foundations that endure beyond seasons, beyond hardship. Eliza Monroe's journey from cast-out widow to Callahan matriarch is not just a tale of the Old West. It is a timeless testament to resilience, to the power of trust, and to the truth that home is not merely where we find shelter, but where we are finally seen, accepted, and chosen. If this story has stirred something in you, know that there are countless more tales, waiting stories of courage and love, of grit and grace, of ordinary people who built extraordinary lives in the wild frontier. Subscribe to this channel to join us on every ride into the heart of the American West. Your support gives us the strength to keep bringing you stories where bullets may have missed, but hearts never did. Don't forget to hit that bell icon so you never miss the next journey along love's wildest trails.